Hello. This is actually my second recording of this video because the first one I forgot to press record on my mic, so that's really cool. Long time no see. I hope you guys are doing well. I'm doing okay. I just completed my first successful little brain viral injection surgery yesterday, solo. So I'm pretty hype about that. Today I kind of wanted to talk about a topic that came up in one of my classes, which is failure in video games. And failure in video games is interesting because failure seems to become something different than what it is in real life when we put it in video games. Because it seems to be almost like a motivator, where in real life it's a deterrent to almost everything. When thinking about this, let's think about failure in real life. You know, when we fail at something, it doesn't feel good. We dislike that feeling. And it can be a very powerful feeling of, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like this. Let's get away from this. If you're always failing at something, you don't really want to do it as much. When thinking about that, I think about a general idea that people kind of magnetize to what they're good at, and then they keep doing that in life. So like maybe if somebody's, pretty tall, they're probably going to end up playing basketball because they're good at that and they enjoy succeeding in that. Or maybe someone's a little bit more art inclined, and they're going to keep doing that. If they really have a really beautiful voice, they might be a singer, stuff like that, where succeeding is something that's going to make you do something again, a positive reinforcer, and failing is like a negative reinforcer in that sense. But that doesn't seem to be the case in video games. I'm actually taking a class on video games for an elective in college. One of the things we looked at is a survey which basically asked people like, what kind of game do you like more? Do you like a game where you can just coast and just win all the time? A game where it's just impossible to beat and you just lose all the time, or a game that's, challenging at first, but it is overcomable and over time you will beat it. I think it's kind of obvious that people would choose that third one, the challenge that you can overcome. But what might catch people by surprise is a lot of people also said that they preferred a game that you would just lose all the time in rather than one you succeed all the time in. Which, this is pretty interesting because if you think about in real life with our real goals, we would want to succeed every step of the way. And it's almost like very desirable that we do and we plan to all the time. For example, if you want to get a job, you apply, you would really enjoy if you got an email back, and you would enjoy it even more if you got an interview, and you would enjoy it even more if that interview went well and then you got a job offer and then you did good in that job and then you got a raise and then, whatever. Any failure along that way is going to be painful, and you're not going to like it. And again, with if you think about dating, you go on a date, you're trying to be perfect the whole time. Even if you mess up a little bit, that can really sting and kind of stay with you for a while and you don't like it. But it seems that in video games, failure or messing up kind of becomes its own cool motivator for people in a way that we desire even more than just plainly succeeding, which is interesting. And you could say it provides maybe some insight into the human psyche and how some motivating factors might be acting in a vacuum. It might be an interesting discovery maybe that failure is more motivating than success. Maybe it's that failure is more motivating than success objectively, like on its own with no circumstances around it. But when you apply it in the real world, almost in like a potentiating way, success becomes more motivating than failure, which is very interesting and really makes you think about people in general. And you could also see this because in games, there's no stakes. There's nothing on the line really. It's just your time, which you're already agreeing to commit to the game. Whereas like in those dating and job examples, you have your career on the line and your love life on the line. And, which could also explain how some games, like gambling, I'm sure everybody would love to always succeed in gambling more than just fail. And I'm sure people would love to just succeed in gambling all the time rather than even lose a little bit and then overcome it. So it's interesting to see how this reward, when you attach a reward to it, then maybe success is just way more motivating than failure. Whereas if there's nothing and, you get both of these in a dark room alone, then failure becomes more motivating in a sense. One game in particular that subjects its users to failure all the time, but has a lot of great success is like the whole Dark Souls series. Dark Souls is a game that's wildly popular, and almost every single player, when they experience it, will die hundreds, if not like thousands of times. And even yet, when someone's dying over and over again, a lot of people still play it and just endure the failure and almost like identify with it and love the process, which is really interesting. Because you would think if failure was so bad and negatively motivating to people, then they would just quit after failing so many times. And it's actually almost like weird how much people fail and how they still stay motivated throughout the whole thing. Because it's also not like this failure in video games just somehow becomes pleasurable, even though it's like more desirable. It's still not, maybe not even more desirable, but people want to interact with it more than interacting with success. Because even when you feel failure in games, it still stings. You still get really frustrated and you still get really mad. I'm sure if you're on the internet watching this video about video game psychology, you've seen like rage compilations where people fail in video games and then they throw everything across the room and then they crash out and go crazy. Like, it would be not smart to say that failure in video games becomes pleasurable, but for some reason failure in video games can almost make people want to play that game more and interact with the game more, which honestly makes me think of an experiment which happened in the lab that I used to work in last year, where basically they would put this rat in a metal box. It's a cage basically, and it has this rod that sticks out in the middle. And when they would put a normal rat in this cage, the rat would explore the cage and touch the rod. And when the rat touched the rod, it would give them an electric foot shock, which obviously they didn't like because it was painful. They would get scared, run and hide in a corner, and never touch that rod again. But they did the same experiment, but this time they hooked it up in a way that when the rat touched the rod, it also released dopamine from their, like we talked about last time, mesocortical limbic dopamine structures. And when they did this, the rat would walk around and then touch the rod, and then they would still feel pain. They would still not really enjoy it. They would get shocked and kind of turn away from it for a second and then come back and press it again, and then press it again, and then press it again, and press it over and over and over again. Which, from those two examples, we can say that activating your dopamine structures is like compelling the rat to interact with the thing that released that dopamine again and again and again, even though it's painful and not really enjoyable for the rat. Now, bringing this back to Dark Souls and video games, I don't think it would be too far of a stretch to say that video games release dopamine. I can't think of a study off the top of my head that shows that, but I'll do some research while I'm editing and put in one of the corners if there is or isn't. But let's just play with the idea that it does release dopamine. So if video games are releasing dopamine while you're going through this failure, it doesn't necessarily matter that you are failing, because you're still getting the dopamine from the game that wants you to react with it over and over again. So it might not be that failure is more desirable in video games or even a motivator or something you want to interact with at all. It might just be that the dopamine you're getting from the game is kind of making you interact with the game over and over again despite failing. That also makes me think of gambling addicts I was talking about earlier. With gambling addicts, if you ever watch any of them, I mean, I don't really know a whole lot about gambling addicts as a whole. What I know about addiction in general, and also watching closely to a gambling addict, I forget his name on Instagram, but I wouldn't say I'm a fan, but I'm a big observer of him. It's Jack something, maybe Boss Jack or Jackman TV or something like this. This guy always gambles, and when he gambles, he wins sometimes. And even though he wins, he keeps interacting with it over and over again. Which you could say, like, you're getting dopamine from winning, you're getting dopamine from gambling, it's making him interact with it over and over again. And even when he loses, he keeps playing. It's like he can't stop himself from playing. And what he does every single time is he keeps playing literally until he can't anymore, which means that he ends up losing money inevitably because, you're not going to be able to beat the casino over and over again. And you can see in the videos that when he fails, it hurts. He freaks out. He goes crazy. And, he goes crazy and he breaks stuff in his house, but it doesn't matter. He just keeps interacting with it over and over and over again. And, gambling is a really interesting thing because it kind of breaks that mold of games being more enjoyable when you fail more than when you only succeed. But it also aligns with the idea that it is still, addictive to play even when you're failing, which is interesting to just think about. I'm not really making a statement here. It's just, giving you some interesting things to think about. Also another interesting thing is thinking about who's susceptible to these games and who enjoys failure, because I'm sure if you guys have played any Dark Souls games, you might have tried getting your friends to play them too. Or let's get away from Dark Souls. If you played any hard, challenging games, you might have tried getting your friends to play it too. And some might really like it, some might really hate it. It's not every single person that loves failing in games. It's just some people, just like with everything. And it's interesting to maybe hypothesize about what would be the makeup of a person who is more susceptible to enjoying failure in games. Or maybe not enjoying, more susceptible to interacting with games that make you fail in general. It might just be people who play more games all the time. If we think about last video, when we looked at pornography, we saw a big hypothesis and almost some evidence that showed people who interact with pornography more and more become hypersensitized to it. And when they're hypersensitized to it, that could actually compel them to interact with it more. So maybe like the people who enjoy games with failure the most are just the most coveted gamers anyways, who play the most games in general. It'd be interesting to test someone who hasn't played games before versus someone who has played video games before. If you put them in Dark Souls and have them play, who's going to want to play for longer? I would predict it's the person who plays video games, but I don't know. But, there's no real conclusion to this video. It's just some interesting ideas and some interesting examples I wanted to point out. And I hope you had fun with it. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.